Welcome back to Let's Talk About It. Today's story has everything: bootleg whiskey, backroom politics, a feud that spiraled into open warfare, and yes, a homemade tank. If you think all the wild Prohibition-era crime stayed in Chicago, wait until you hear what happened down in Southern Illinois. A homemade tank, like it's a normal Tuesday. Because that's the hook here, right? We've all heard the big names: Capone, Moran, the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. But this is the Midwest story that somehow didn't make it into everyone's history class. Picture Southern Illinois in the 1920s. Not skyscrapers and speakeasies. More like small towns, farmland, backroads, and coal country. It sounds quiet on the surface. But Prohibition changed the math. Suddenly, booze isn't just a drink, it's a business. And in a place with plenty of roads, plenty of hiding spots, and plenty of people trying to make ends meet, organized crime didn't just arrive. It took root. And when it takes root, it needs a structure. Enter the Shelton brothers. The Sheltons weren't a one-man show. This was a family operation. 3 brothers with different roles, like a company that just happens to break every law on the books. Carl Shelton, the oldest, was the brains. He worked the angles: relationships, payoffs, political leverage. Earl Shelton was more of the operations manager, keeping shipments moving, money flowing, and gambling running like clockwork. And Bernie Shelton was the muscle. The guy you didn't want to see stepping out of a car if you've been talking a little too loud about the Sheltons. So, they're not just brawlers with bottles in their pockets. They're organized, strategic, and Prohibition turns that strategy into an empire. And here's the thing: Southern Illinois wasn't only dealing with bootleggers. At the same time, the Ku Klux Klan was gaining influence in pockets of the region, which adds gasoline to an already burning situation. Because the Klan wasn't just a social club. In a lot of places, they try to act like self-appointed moral police. Their pitch, at least publicly, was that they were there to clean things up. No drinking, no gambling, no anything they labeled immoral. And because they had members in local offices and law enforcement, they weren't just yelling from the sidelines. They could actually cause real problems for bootleggers and roadhouse owners. So for the Sheltons, that's not just competition. That's a threat to the entire business model. And the community gets split right down the middle. Some people supported Prohibition and liked the Klan's crackdown. Others saw bootlegging as survival. Money in hard times, jobs, trade, something to keep the lights on. Over time, the Klan's influence faded in the area, and the Sheltons filled that vacuum, which is when the Sheltons stopped behaving like they need to hide. That's one of the creepiest parts of this story. Once they had enough control, they didn't have to operate like ghosts in the night. They ran roadhouses openly, some of them basically nonstop around the clock. Walk in and you'd find drinking, gambling, dice, whatever money could buy, and whatever the law supposedly forbade. And if you're thinking, why didn't the authorities shut it down? Well, when the right politicians are on your payroll, the law can get pretty quiet. So at this point, it's not just crime. It's a shadow government. They don't just break rules. They shape the environment around them. That's a great way to put it. But every empire eventually runs into a problem that isn't just the police. Sometimes it's internal. And for the Sheltons, that problem had a name: Charlie Birger. Birger is one of those names that feels like it should be in every documentary. And yet most people have never heard it. He was once close to the Shelton organization, trusted, powerful, running a big chunk of their operation in Saline County. But around the mid-1920s, something snapped. Birger turns on them. And the spark, as the story goes, wasn't just business. It was personal. Allegedly personal, and only a rumor. And it's a rumor that mattered because people acted on it, was that Carl Shelton was involved with Birger's girlfriend. And that kind of accusation doesn't stay private in a world built on pride, reputation, and intimidation. It becomes a match tossed into a barrel of gasoline. The fallout wasn't a quiet betrayal. It became one of the most violent gang conflicts the Midwest ever saw. When people hear gang war, they might picture drive-bys or street shootouts. But this escalated into something unreal. Let's talk about the level of unreal. The Sheltons, trying to take out Birger's stronghold, supposedly built a homemade armored vehicle, basically their own crude tank. Imagine the mindset behind that. Not, we'll send a message. Not, we'll bribe a judge. But let's engineer a moving weapon and roll it up to his hideout. That's not petty crime anymore. That's combat thinking. And if you think Birger responded with anything less than chaos, no. Birger reportedly retaliated by using an airplane to drop improvised bombs. That sentence still doesn't feel real. A plane, bombs, in southern Illinois, in the 1920s. It turns quiet countryside into a war zone. People end up dead in numbers that shock communities. Violence spills outward, and when violence becomes routine, everyone around it is forced to pick a side or keep their head down. So who wins a war like that? Because it doesn't sound like a victory comes clean. That's the twist. Even though the Sheltons had numbers, Birger outmaneuvered them in a way that wasn't just bullets. He found a path through the legal system. The Sheltons get taken down and arrested over something relatively minor, connected to a mail carrier robbery. Not the bombings, not the shootouts, not the terror. Something that on paper could actually stick, which is such a darkly practical lesson. You can survive a lot of violence, but paperwork and technicalities can still put you away. Birger takes the field, but then he doesn't get to enjoy the result for long, because eventually the state comes for him. In 1928, Birger is arrested and convicted for the murder of Joe Adams, who was tied to the Sheltons and also served as mayor of West City, Illinois. Birger is sentenced to death, and his hanging becomes a huge moment. It's remembered as the last public execution by hanging in the state of Illinois. And that feels like a symbolic full stop on the era. Not that crime ends, not that corruption disappears, but that this particular kind of open warfare hits a wall. And what about the Sheltons? They don't just evaporate. They serve time, then they come back. The brothers are released around 1930, and they try to rebuild their operation. But the country is changing. Prohibition won't last forever. And once it ends, the big money shifts. Gambling becomes a major focus. Except now, they're not just fighting regional enemies. Now they're on the radar of bigger, more professional outfits, especially out of Chicago. That's the problem. Chicago doesn't love competition, and it definitely doesn't love competition that's getting bold on what they consider their territory. The Shelton story turns grim from there. Carl Shelton is murdered, killed by Chicago mob figures. Bernie Shelton also ends up murdered, reportedly for pushing too far into territory that Chicago considered theirs. So the same pattern repeats: build an empire, dominate locally, and then get crushed by either the law or a larger criminal machine. And then there's Earl, the brother who doesn't end in a headline-style death. He leaves. He goes to Florida and lives quietly for decades, dying in 1986, nearly 100 years old. That's such a strange epilogue. Two brothers end violently. One disappears into a long life. It's like three different endings to the same book. And the whole story sticks around as regional legend. Not everyone in America knows the Shelton gang the way they know Capone, but in southern Illinois, the names still carry weight. Partly because of what they did, and partly because of how brazen it all was. Because it wasn't subtle. It was roadhouses operating like they were legal businesses, politics tangled up with criminals, and then that feud with Birger that escalated into bombs and homemade armor. It's a reminder that American crime history isn't only written in big cities. Sometimes the most unbelievable chapters happen on backroads, where the line between law and power gets blurred fast. And once that line disappears, you get exactly what Southern Illinois got for a time. Bootleggers with influence, enemies with badges, and a gang war that made farmland feel like a battlefield. So the next time someone says, nothing ever happens in small towns, you can tell them. Sometimes it does. And sometimes it involves a tank somebody built in a garage. That's it for today's episode of Let's Talk About It. If you want more stories like this, less familiar names, but absolutely jaw-dropping history, stick around. We'll be back soon with another chapter you probably didn't learn in school.